I want to welcome everybody to the Village of Milford and Milford Township. This is our Civic Center that we share. My name is Christian Worth. I am the Village Manager for the Village of Milford. Wanted to let everybody from the different agencies kind of go through and introduce themselves. So I'm here from the Village, Milford Township.
I'm Don Green, Milford Township Supervisor.
We've got from the City of Wixom.
Steve Brown, City Manager with Wixom.
From the Watershed Council.
I'm Laura Richmond, Manager of the Watershed Council.
And we've got a few people from the Department of Environmental Quality and the Department of Health and Human Services from the state.
I'm Lisa Fisher. I'm with the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, and I'm a toxicologist. What about now? Good? Okay. I'm Lisa Fisher. I'm a toxicologist with the Drinking Water Unit at the Department of Health and Human Services.
Can you hear me too? Gary Clace with another toxicologist at MDHHS.
Hi, I'm with the Michigan Department of Agriculture and Rural Development. My name is Kevin Bessie, and I'm kind of for any questions you have on animals or plant health, gardens and that kind of thing.
Good evening. I'm Tracy Kescometti with the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality. I work in our Southeast Michigan District Office.
Hello, I'm Jennifer Gray. I'm a toxicologist with the Division of Environmental Health at the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Kamer, and I work in Lansing in our Lansing District Office, but I work for Water Resources Division.
Yep. I'm Joe Bohr. I'm a biologist with the Water Resources Division with the DEQ.
Hi, I'm Ann Tavalier with the Department of Environmental Quality. I work in our Southeast Michigan office in the Water Resources Division.
Melinda Steffler, also with the DEQ Water Resources Division, Southeast Michigan District Office.
And also from Oakland County Health Department, we have
Tony Dratz, I'm the Environmental Health Administrator with Oakland County Health.
I think that is everybody that we've got. Did I miss anybody? Okay. So this meeting came about a month ago, shortly after the advisories were first issued, and there was some clarification in the village, and in talking with the township and others, there were a lot of questions that came in. So I reached out to Laura at the Watershed Council and asked if they might be interested to come in and do a presentation with us to kind of talk about the things going on with the Huron River. The PFAS issue quickly started picking up steam. And so at that point, Laura reached out to the state agencies. We reached out to the other local governments around, as well as the county, to invite everybody in. So that's kind of how we got here tonight. A bulk of the presentation is going to be on the PFAS issue specifically, but Laura does have some stuff at the end kind of on the general health of the river. So before we get into the presentation, I'm going to turn it over to Laura.
Thank you, Christian. I do want to say there's a couple empty seats in the front if people want to move in. We do have seats. I want to thank you all for coming tonight and for your interest. This is a new and emerging issue for us, and I feel like every week we're all learning something new together and trying to place it in a context of what is the threat to human and environmental health. So I'm hoping tonight we can present some data, we can talk about some of the issues that are of your concern, and we can address this as a community. I do want to also introduce three of the staff members from the Watershed Council who are here, because if there are questions, that's Dan Brown in the back, if you could raise your hand. Pam Labadie is in the back corner with Anita Daly. And feel free to talk to them. We have a bunch of material outside, and we've started to try to compile a lot of this information on our website. So as Christian said, we're first going to have a presentation from the DEQ and MDHHS. Then Stephen Brown from Wixom will be talking. I'll follow it up with a little bit about the Huron River in general and what we know. And then you all should have note cards. Please start putting down questions that you have with your name and your optional email. I do ask that you keep your questions pertaining to PFAS. There's a lot of information we want to get, and we don't want to get sidetracked on other issues tonight. That's not to say that we don't want to address your concerns. We do, but that's why if you could submit them on a note card, if it has something to do that's not related to the topic tonight, we will follow up with you after the meeting. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tracy Kescometti. Thanks.
Thank you, Laura. Christian, you're going to advance the slides? Great. Can everybody hear me okay? I'm trying to not have to hold this the whole time, but I want to make sure you can all hear me. So thank you again to the Village of Milford and Milford Township and the Huron River Watershed Council for hosting this event. We really appreciate all the logistical support and the community support. And it's great to see this level of interest. We're so glad that you all took the time to be here tonight. We know that there's a lot of other places you could be, but this is a really important topic, and we have a lot of information we want to share with you. So I'm going to start with just sort of a general overview. And like I said, I work out of our Southeast Michigan District office. I have sort of a day job related to landfills and waste management, but I'm also part of our PFAS team. And then Stephanie Kamer, who works out of our Lansing office, she's our Huron River Watershed Project Manager. And she's going to really bring it local and share with you all of the data we have and all of the information we know about water quality here locally. Then you're going to hear from Steve about some things that the City of Wixom is doing, and Jennifer Gray about health issues and fish. And then when we do, what's that?
Joe's going to talk too.
Oh, good. Okay. And Joe is our fish biologist, and he is brilliant and a great resource for us. And so I'm glad that he can be here. And then we're going to open it up to questions, but certainly any of us here on the panel might jump in and to answer some of your questions. So please go ahead. So I know that this is a really well-informed crowd, and there's a lot in the news about PFAS, and there's a lot of information out there that I'm sure you've been reading, and so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the basics, but I do want to at least lay the groundwork, just so that we're all at sort of the same level of information, so that when Stephanie really gets into the data, we're all kind of starting from the same place. So we think of PFAS as an emerging contaminant. And that's not necessarily because it's a brand new chemical. It's not, right? It's been around for a long time. But it's emerging because the body of science is still growing. There's a lot we don't know. And there's not a regulatory framework in place for PFAS. So we don't have the same kind of laws and rules and guidance and sort of regulatory framework that we might have for lead and copper in water, or other arsenic in drinking water, or contaminants in soil and that sort of thing. So this is a situation where the law hasn't really kept up with the science, and the science is evolving really quickly. And what we're learning about it is changing all of the time. And so we consider it an emerging contaminant. I will not get any farther into chemistry than I'm qualified to do, but it's sort of thought of as a wonder chemical, really. It's nearly indestructible, and that's why it's been so successful, and that's why it is so problematic. It is incredibly persistent. So for the chemists out there, there's a carbon-fluorine bond that is incredibly strong and incredibly stable and does not readily break down. So not in sunlight, not with microbes in the soil, things that you might think of like gasoline contamination or something that breaks down over time in the environment. PFAS chemicals are incredibly stable. They're also water resistant and oil resistant. So their chemical structure makes them sort of funny. They like to hang out right at the top of the water, and they cause like a film, and they reduce the surface tension, which is what makes them so effective at fighting fires or protecting workers in chrome plating operations, but it also makes them really difficult to handle from an environmental remediation standpoint. And PFAS has been used and actually let me back up a little bit. You don't have to back up the slide, but just in terms of terminology. So let's start. PFAS, PFAS, is per and poly fluoroalkyl substances. It's a whole family of man-made chemicals. This is not naturally occurring stuff. These are all man-made chemicals. It's a family of like 4,700 different chemicals. You'll hear us talk about PFOS most tonight because that's really the one that drives our water quality issues here locally, but that is one of 4,700 chemicals. Okay, so we're going to try to say PFOS so that you understand what's going on sort of here and with the data, but PFAS is the overall group of chemicals. PFOS is one of them. PFOA is another. And it's those two that we've developed some guidelines and criteria on here in Michigan because they're the most widely studied, they're the most widely used. We understand more about their toxicology than we do the thousands of other chemicals. But it's not to say that they all behave the same or that they all do the same thing. But those are the two we're going to talk about. So we're going to try to say PFOS so as to not confuse the lingo, okay? But they've really been used in a wide range of applications, both commercial and industrial. And so, early on, the focus was on worker exposure, and what's happening in places where workers are exposed to this or in areas where this stuff was manufactured. But we're really starting to understand more about our sort of everyday base load exposure to this, from our waterproof clothing and our scotch-guarded carpets and our stain-treated couches and our hamburger wrappers that don't absorb oil and grease in our pizza boxes and all of these applications, right? And so I think of it as us having sort of a base load of exposure from all of these everyday products. But then there's this issue of kind of hotspot environmental contamination that comes with its commercial or industrial use. And so it's really effective at putting out really bad fires. So jet fuel fires, airplane crashes, tire fires, refinery fires. And so this is why the military has trained with it and has been prepared, right? I mean, these are life-saving chemicals in these situations. There's industrial applications, like I've spoken about, where they're used in plating baths to protect workers from the toxic fumes coming out of the plating bath. It puts a fine layer on the tank, right? And we weren't aware of the issue we were generating by using that material. So there's industrial applications and there's sort of these everyday applications, but it's literally in hundreds, thousands of products. So now that we have sort of a baseline information, we're going to talk about what your government is doing about it. Governor Snyder signed an executive directive in 2017 organizing something called the Michigan PFAS Action Response Team. We call it the MPART. And this is really just a framework for state government to tackle a really big problem that does not fall neatly in one department or division. We did not intend to bring an army here to overwhelm you in numbers, but truly we all have a piece. We have a fish biologist and a toxicologist and a water quality person, and we have a whole team of people working in different regards, right? And so the intention of MPART was so that all of those divisions and all of those departments would work together to tackle a really big problem without the sort of, the obstacles that come with different organizations. Okay? And really the goal of MPART, and you can advance this slide, Christian, our first and foremost priority is public health. And so making sure that people are drinking safe water and eating safe fish. This is our number one priority. There's a lot of challenges associated with this. I mean, we have sites that we know about. We have sites that we're learning about every day. At the same time, MPART is working to advance the science. So we have experts that we've contracted from universities and other organizations to advise us on the science and to help us grow the science and do different things. We're also trying to work with communities to solve these problems. I mean, this is not a simple fix. This is not a turn it off sort of fix, okay? So we're working with communities, we're working with the responsible parties, we're working with property owners to address these problems. This is the map that we started with of known sites. And we used to say we have 35 known areas around the state. And this is sort of where we started. And it was some military bases and it was some areas of historic industrial use. But this has grown through our sort of partly through our proactive efforts to look for additional sources. And the one thing I want to emphasize about this, because I know this is a bummer, right? Like to think about Michigan, right? Like surrounded by all this water and that we've got this gross contamination problem. But this is not an issue that is something, just Michigan is dealing with. The problem is we're the ones looking for it. Okay, so we know about it here and it seems like we have this huge contamination problem because we're looking for it. Many, many states are not looking. Okay, so as hard as this is to understand, to take this on, that we have this problem in our community, we're ahead of the curve, and we can't fix problems until we know about them. And so we're in sort of we're ahead of the game in that regard. So this was a starting point, but this is by no means comprehensive. We're finding new problems all the time. So one thing I want to talk about is criteria and guidelines, because sometimes you hear in the news, right, like water system tested positive for PFAS or lake this is it's not like a flu test, right? It's not positive or negative. It's a matter of how much is there and what does that mean? And so I want to talk about the criteria and the guidelines so that when Stephanie talks about the local data, it's a little bit easier to understand. But first I want to just remind, we don't have consistent guidelines across the country. They're not federal standards. There's not an enforceable number in the Safe Drinking Water Act. Okay, this is not considered a hazardous waste under our hazardous waste laws. So the states that have criteria for this, there's some differences out there. And so that's what I'm talking about. This is an emerging contaminant. It's new science. We're figuring this out as we go. And so if you read that another state has a different criteria, or a different country has a different criteria, or the federal government's thinking about a different criteria, it's because we don't have consistency with this yet. And so we're using the best science that we have to guide our decision making. So when we think about drinking water, we think about PFOA and PFOS. Those are two of the big family. And the trigger level we use is 70 parts per trillion. And a part per trillion is like 1 grain of sand in a trillion grains of sand, okay? And it's either for PFOA or PFOS together individually, okay? And Jennifer will do a much better job explaining the sort of lifetime health advisory that goes along with that. But keep in mind 70 for drinking water and for groundwater. But like I said, this is not an enforceable number under the Safe Drinking Water Act. So it's not like water systems have to test for this, and if they're above a number, there's a law that applies. Okay, this is a health guideline that we're using. Michigan took the effort to implement a groundwater standard that is enforceable under our remediation law. We did that this past January, and it's also 70 parts per trillion. It gets a little more complicated when we think about surface water. So PFOS is really the driver, because it's and Stephanie and Joe will correct me when I get this wrong, but it's the one that's more bioaccumulative. Okay, so PFOA, you'll see those numbers are higher because the PFOS bioaccumulates more in the fish. And those numbers, the 11 and 12, we use 11 when a water body is used for drinking water, like if you have a water plant that sucks the water in, and we use 12 if it's not a drinking water source. Same thing on PFOA. But what I want to stress about those numbers is the 11 and 12 is still for human health. Those numbers are protective of fish for fish consumption. If it was just a matter of the fish health, that's when you're looking at that complicated chart on the bottom. What's safe for fish, for like a chronic toxicity value or an acute toxicity value, is those hundreds of thousands and millions parts per trillion that you see on the bottom. So don't be mistaken that we use 11 or 12 to protect the fish, but we're using 70 to protect us. Like, what's wrong? That's not the case. The 11 and 12 still protects us. It protects us for eating that fish. And if I got that wrong, these guys will elaborate. But that's the criteria I want you to keep in mind. So when we think about whether or not a stream meets water quality standards or exceeds water quality standards, we're looking at that 11 and 12 for PFOS. And this was just sort of that parts per trillion part, I know that we don't all learn the metric system, or if we did, a lot of us have long forgotten it, but this is how we measure it. And so, normally in environmental remediation, we think about parts per million or parts per billion. PFAS, we're talking about in the parts per trillion, and we're seeing that we need to take action at this level. This graphic is kind of complicated, but it's intended to show you how PFAS can move around the environment, right? That it can originate at an industrial facility and either go through their sewer pipe to the wastewater treatment plant, or go through their storm sewer out to a creek, or waste can go into a landfill, and then that leachate ends up in a wastewater treatment plant. Sometimes those biosolids from a sewage plant might get land applied to a farm. You can have a fire where that foam infiltrates and soaks into the groundwater. And so when we think about fixing this, and we might think, well, just go dig it up, right, and put it in a landfill. Well, the landfill is going to generate leachate that's going to go back into the wastewater treatment plant and back into the river. And so these are big problems, and they require really technical fixes. And so this is just sort of illustrating how PFAS moves around our environment. The next thing I want to talk about is what we're doing to make sure that everyone's drinking safe water. And so, like I mentioned, there's not an enforceable number under the Safe Drinking Water Act. So water plants are not required to test public water for PFAS. A few years ago, 2013, 2014, the EPA runs a program called the Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Rule, where they say, here's a contaminant that we don't require everyone to test for, but we want to know if it's out there. And we want to know if we need to start worrying about it. So all of these water plants should test for it. So a few years back, a number of water plants in Michigan tested for it. And the city of Ann Arbor was one that tested for it. They have an intake down on the Huron River at Barton Pond. And they found some PFAS in their water, and that's what started this issue on the Huron River. Many of our water plants in Michigan did not find it, but it's not because it wasn't there. It's because at the time, our lab capabilities were not able to measure it down to the levels that we're concerned about. Okay, and so this is part of that emerging contaminant thing, like the science is continuing to evolve. So what we've decided to do is take a proactive approach and sample every public water supply in Michigan. The water supplies aren't required to do it. The testing is expensive. It's a big burden to put on communities. And so we've gone out and we're going to sample every public water supply in Michigan by the end of the year. This is a sort of a local map of what's happening here. We're almost done in Oakland County, done in Wayne County. I think that number for Macomb and St. Clair is misleading because along the St. Clair River we have about 8 or 10 large public water intakes, and those were all sampled as well. What hasn't been sampled in Macomb and St. Clair County is inland, like the small water supplies. But like here in Oakland County, we've sampled all of the small water supplies that serve small villages, like the village of Milford, apartment complexes, mobile home communities, schools that have their own wells. We've sampled all of those. And I think I've got the next map. This is meant more for scale, okay, not for detail. The black dots are every public water supply that's been tested and has been non-detect for PFAS. So we have sampled hundreds of public water supplies. I think the total number that we have across the state that's being sampled is like 1,400? It's over 1,000. So this is sort of across the metro region with just a few exceptions. There are a few that have been detected in the under 20 range, but no public water supply in this area has tested above that 70 number. And all of these inland systems are groundwater systems, except for the city of Ann Arbor. The rest of us all get our water, off of the Detroit River and the St. Clair River there. The next map zooms this in a little bit so you can see what's going on locally. So there's that bump in 96, and you see Kent Lake there. I apologize, it's small, but you can see some black dots, and those are the public water supplies in this immediate region. And again, the black dots are non-detect. So those are well water systems where the groundwater has sampled non-detect for PFAS. And then this is the sort of chain of lakes area down Strawberry Lake, Zuki Lake. We thought we might pull some folks from down in that area to this meeting. And so this, again, the black dots show the community water supplies that have been sampled, and PFAS has not been found. But like I mentioned before, a lot of this really started with the city of Ann Arbor. So EPA's program, that Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Program, they sampled back in 2013 and 2014, and they did find PFAS. And the city of Ann Arbor's water supply is made up of a combination of the Huron River water, and they also have a couple of well fields. So the next thing they did was they sampled both of those, and the well field was non-detect and the river was not. And so they decided, okay, this is coming from the Huron River. And the city of Ann Arbor then sampled upstream, up toward Dexter, and found levels in about the 20s and 30s. So above that water quality number of 11 that we're concerned with, but below that drinking water number. But it told us something was going on in the river for sure. And so Ann Arbor took the proactive step of starting to sample their water supply every month. Again, not required under law, but something they thought was necessary to protect their consumers, right? The other thing they're doing is they're conducting a treatment study. They've installed some activated carbon filters on their treatment plant, and they're doing a study to see if that's something that's effective at reducing the levels of PFAS in their water supply. But it was this is sort of the origin story in the Huron River. And so it was that sampling upstream, they sampled up to Dexter, that really told us, and Joe and Stephanie started looking at that and said we need to do more investigation in the Huron River. I think that's where I end, and Stephanie starts talking about that investigation. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Tracy. Let me know if I'm not, I'm going to lean forward. I'm short, so I have to make sure I talk up here. So the DEQ surface water sampling, I just want to cover that Water Resources Division. We do a lot of statewide, I should really let Joe do this, but He's our SWAS person that does this. But we do surface water sampling statewide, and specifically for PFAS, we've collected over 300 ambient surface water samples from 20 water bodies sent for PFAS through last month. So that's a lot that we've done, and that's just within the last, how many years would you say, Joe?
That's mostly this past year.
That's mostly this past year. So this is statewide. Some of the surface waters that we've sampled where we've seen PFAS levels actually fairly low are the St. Mary's, St. Clair, Detroit rivers. There's 7 major watersheds that we're sampling where we're doing more intensive work, where we do have elevated levels and we're looking for sources, and those include the Kalamazoo River. Everybody may have heard of the Parchment, and so we're looking, we're doing pretty extensive sampling there. The St. Joseph River, the River Raisin, Clinton River, Rogue River, Huron River, and also the Flint River. We actually started source tracking in the Flint River several years ago based on some samples where we had some elevated levels, and also tracked that source back to a wastewater treatment plant, and we've been working with them on a very similar issue to what we're working with Wixom and their industrial user on today. So, next slide. So in the Huron, after Ann Arbor did their surface water sampling and identified the elevated levels in the surface water up into the Dexter area of the Huron River, we realized that we really needed to look at the extent of PFAS in the river and try to figure out where it was coming from. And so we put together a plan that went through the pretty large stretch of the river all the way down to the mouth. We looked at several of the major tributaries coming into the river, and these are the results. If you can see them, the yellow indicate we detected PFAS, but they were below our water quality standards, which would be 12 or 11. The red is indicating that they're above. From this study that was, done in July 24th, we identified the Norton Creek area, which drains from, the South Lyon area. It actually starts down in South Lyon, flows north through the village of Wixom, and then through Milford Township, and it empties into the Huron River east of Milford. So those levels up there were very elevated. They were at 5,500 parts per trillion, which is a very high surface water sample for us. The next downstream sample that we took in the Huron River was also elevated, so we knew we had sources going on in that area. As you went down the Huron River, the next sample point was just above Strawberry Lake, and that shows a decrease in the levels. It was still above our standards, but it was down to 15. So it's dramatically decreased. The next sample point was just below Portage Lake and Baseline Lake, and that was at 11, which is right at where our standards would be. And then the rest kind of gradually went down. There was one other sample point that showed a spike, and that was in Willow Creek, where we have some potential known sources there with an airport and an old automotive facility. And that level was about 26 parts per trillion. So again, those are much lower than what we were seeing in Norton Creek. So based on that, we knew that our efforts needed to ramp up in the Wixom, Milford area to look for additional sources.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yes.
This is showing the fish data that we collected. The furthest upstream results that we have at this point, at least, is the Kent Lake samples, and those were extremely high, and that's really what started the do not eat advisory. But we also have fish from Baseline Lake down at the bottom of the chain of lakes there that were very close to the 300 parts per billion do not eat level, and that along with the fish from Argo Pond, which were above the 300 at 404 parts per billion. I show it right there in case you don't know where it is. Argo Pond had 404 parts per billion. So it was decided by the health department that basically we should have a do not eat advisory all the way down the river until we find out differently. We do have some data from Portage Lake, which is connected to Baseline Lake. It's not really in the flow of the Huron River, but there's concern about potentially fish moving back and forth for one thing, plus we just didn't have enough information at that point. We do have new results now that shows fish, these happen to be largemouth bass at 76 parts per billion, which is in the 2 meals per month range, but we still don't have a whole lot of data, and we may potentially have sources we need to look into for Portage Lake itself. We've got some data from the Flat Rock impoundment down here towards the mouth. These are for channel catfish that had a fairly low level. This is not enough to cause a do not eat, certainly. It's 11 parts per billion would be, we'd call it a secondary contaminant. What's really driving the advisory for catfish down there would be PCBs and mercury. But it's not a lot of data, and catfish don't necessarily show the best picture. So we've collected more fish down there, and we'll have to get those analyzed as well. We've also collected fish from Belleville Lake. We collected more from Arbor Pond to add to that picture there, and we've got fish from Barton Pond. We've got fish from Hubble Pond here downstream of Milford, and we plan to catch some from Proud Lake, which we expect to be low based on what we've seen in the water concentrations up that way. But we just want to verify that. So that's, I think, all I've got for that slide. And Jennifer can add to this too if she needs to, but this is basically what I just said, is that the advisory extends all the way from, including Norton Creek, and then from the Norton Creek confluence in the Huron River all the way down to the mouth at Lake Erie. So that's a do not eat advisory. Next.
Okay, so it's back to me. So based on, the fish data and the surface water data that we got from July, we knew that we had really elevated levels in the Huron River and the upper Huron in the Norton Creek area. We put together a second round of sampling that was going to be more intensive, specifically in Norton Creek and in the tributaries right around Kent Lake. We didn't want to just look at Norton Creek because we wanted to make sure we didn't miss anything. So this is kind of, I know it's difficult to read, and I'll try to get my pointer out so I can point to what I'm talking about as we go. Here, if I can. Aha. Yeah. But the one thing that we did know, we have a program, I think there's going to be a slide about it later. When we went into this, we did know that we had the Wixom wastewater treatment plant that had went through an industrial pretreatment program to look for sources of PFAS into their system. This was a very new initiative that we started this year, and we knew that they had elevated levels because they had went through this process and notified us of this. So you'll see them here. So the Wixom wastewater treatment plant's right there in the middle. But just going first through the surface water data that came from August, and we just got these results in last Thursday. So these are kind of hot off the presses. We're sharing it with you because we want to make sure that everyone's informed of what we're finding. But if you start with the the upstream portions of Norton Creek, we went and sampled. Here's 96. Here's the old former Ford Wixom plant. We sampled some levels upstream, and I almost can't read that, but I know they're below water quality standards. I can't actually read the number from here. 6.5. So that was, it's there, but it's pretty low. Again, the level would be 12. The Ford Wixom plant, we actually went to a couple of the ponds that are there. We went to an outfall, like their stormwater outfall, sampled that, and then we did the receiving stream that would be right there at the outfall. And they were, PFAS is there. These are all PFOS numbers, but again, they're fairly low. They're double digit. So in the ponds, I think they were I think there was one that was 5, and the other was maybe 20. It's not on this map. The outfall was in, the low 30s, and then the actual receiving stream is 38. So, there's something there, but is it our major source that we're seeing where we get the 5,500 up in Norton Creek? It doesn't seem that way. So then following upstream, this is where it would have been, we probably needed the computer because I really can't read this. Oops.
There you go. You're looking at the...
Maybe I can walk over. Well, I can't walk over to it because then you won't hear me. Okay, so following upstream, the next one downstream, of the Ford plant was a 10 in the stream there. Again, we're not even near close to what we think a source would be. We keep going upstream. There's a west branch of the Norton Creek, and we get a kind of an interesting number there of an 80, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But once you get to the Wixom wastewater treatment plant here, their discharge comes in here, and that's where we see the first kind of spike. And so, like I said, we already knew that they had elevated levels coming out from their effluent. This kind of just tells us, yes, it's impacting the stream. We're seeing it here as we go downstream up into where it confluences with the Huron River. It goes up a little bit higher. It's 1,900 and then 1,500. So, I mean, basically this tells us, which I think we already knew in working with the city, that this is something that, we're going to be focused on. They immediately were working to reach out to their industrial user to work on it. The upstream portion of the Huron River, where it comes through Proud Lake, is very low. There's, I think, the PFAS. These numbers are probably actually below reporting limits. So they actually probably should be reported as non-detect, because 1.1, most labs can't even detect that. That's more of just a guess when they put that there. There might be something there, but it's really low. So that's good news, that you don't have any potential sources up and in this area. One of the surprise for us as we looked at the data was Pettibone Creek comes down through the village of Milford. I think there's Mill Pond and then your Central Park area. We actually had a really elevated level in Pettibone Creek at 500. And that makes sense because around the same time we got received monitoring results back from, we have a couple point source discharges, and when I say point source discharges, there's a couple of groundwater cleanup discharges where they're taking groundwater that's contaminated, putting it through treatment, and then discharging it into Mill Pond. And so we actually, as part of a proactive program to look to say, are these a potential source contributing to this issue, we sampled those discharges and found that Coast Cleaner, which is actually a DEQ managed site, does have a discharge of PFAS in their effluent to Mill Pond, and that was at 1,000 parts per trillion. And it's kind of a surprise to us. Cleaners, we knew that maybe they did some fabric treatment, but we weren't really expecting to see this. So, but again, looking at the data, we have the 500 here. We have this. We also sampled at this Kelsey Hayes groundwater cleanup. We don't have the results back yet, so we're going to wait and see what that is. But I think there's another site, and I'll get into what's a follow-up for some of these point sources.
Those cleanups are not for PFAS too.
They're right, and Joe just pointed out to me, we have to keep in mind these groundwater cleanups that are currently permitted, they're not for PFAS. They're for other contaminants that are there. So PFAS is a new issue. This is the first time we've sampled these discharges for PFOS. As you go down the river, I think there's the Milford wastewater treatment plant. We sampled them. They're not part of our PFAS initiative with our treatment plants that have IPP programs, but we sampled them because we wanted to make sure they weren't contributing. Their results, they had 3 parts per trillion of PFAS, which is very low for a wastewater treatment plant, and so we don't consider them to be a source. Below in the surface water itself, below the dam, we have a surface water sample result of 300. And again, I think this is the impact probably of Pettibone Creek and then Norton Creek coming into the Huron River. We also sampled Man Creek, which actually empties into the Huron River below Kent Lake. And we sampled that because it's right in the area where we had the high fish, and because we knew there was a potential source. We didn't have any real good reason to suspect it, but with GM Proving Grounds being there, we had talked to them about it. We actually sampled they have several different types of permitted discharges. They have non-contact cooling water. They have a groundwater cleanup discharge. I think they have a sanitary sanitary wastewater discharge as well. We sampled what would be reflective of those, and the results were really low. So we got those results back before we got the surface water results back. So we were kind of surprised when we got Man Creek back, which is downstream of GM, when we had 150. So we would consider that elevated. And so I think the next slide. Oh. That would be. Okay. Is this me then?
That's you.
Okay. I wasn't.
Sorry.
Tracy is trying to test my skills. She changed the slides around on us, and we are learning as we're going through them. So basically, I've been talking about the industrial pretreatment program, but I just want to give you a little bit of background on what that is. This is a big initiative that we did in Michigan because we had some experience working in the Flint River with the city of Lapeer, who also had a chrome plating facility, and we had elevated levels in their effluent. We learned from that, and we implemented a program statewide with all of our wastewater treatment plants that have industrial users and are required to have an industrial pretreatment program. And what that means is that they have to have controls, they have to have ordinances and a regulating program to ensure that those industrial users that might discharge pollutants that a normal conventional wastewater treatment plant process won't remove, that they don't discharge pollutants to their system that could pass through and cause a water quality violation, or could interfere with the processes at the plant and cause an upset, or could accumulate in the biosolids and restrict how they're managed. So we required 93 wastewater treatment plants statewide to do that. Wixom participated in that. They went through the process. They sampled probable sources within their system. And I hope I'm not overlapping on.
A little bit, that's all right.
I can just skip through some of this so I don't steal your thunder. But basically, they found Tribar manufacturing as their main, as really your only source at this point contributing PFAS to the system. Tribar's discharge was elevated at 28,000. And so I also want to take a moment to talk about the plating, because this is something that we are finding. Like I already mentioned with Lapeer, we had a very similar issue there. We have 3 other wastewater treatment plants with plating facilities that are also going through this. So it's Tribar is not alone, Wixom's not alone, and it's not an issue of these facilities are acting in bad faith or that they're trying to get out of anything or that they're, saving money by using chemicals they shouldn't be using or not disposing of things or cleaning things out. This is really something that no one understood was happening until we identified it. I think one other company in Minnesota, they had identified this, but really we were the first to really look at it at the scale we are. So part of why platers were finding it there, they were required back in the 90s through federal regulations to actually use technology to, like Tracy talked about, to protect workers' health and the environment from hexchrome emissions in the factory. And the way they did that is by using a PFOS-based mist suppressant in their system, and that was a requirement in the 90s. As EPA went along and our understanding of PFAS grew, it became clear that that wasn't a good thing. So EPA put a ban in and required that all the plating facilities switch to a PFOS-free mist suppressant. It still has that, it still has a PFAS chemical base, but it's not PFOS. So that, I know that gets confusing. But Tribar complied. They switched by 2015. They haven't used that chemical in their system since that time. The interesting thing with Tribar is that they had 2 plants. They have 2 plants that do very similar things. One plant is older, and it switched. Like I said, it used the PFOS-free, or it used the PFOS-based product up until 2015, and then switched. The other plant was built in 2017 and never used that PFOS-based product. when the city sampled them, they found that the new plant was below 20 parts per trillion in their effluent per PFOS, whereas the new plant, it's using the exact same chemical now and has switched for over 3 years, has the elevated result. So this matches up to what we're seeing with our other facilities statewide. It matches up to what Minnesota found when they looked at their facility. So again, it's really not an issue of this company is acting in bad faith. It's an issue of us understanding what's going on and looking at it to get the treatment in control now that we know it's there. I think that. Oh. Okay, sorry.
All right, so I'm Steve Brown, the city manager with the city of Wixom. Just to follow up a little bit about what was said a second ago, as Stephanie mentioned, there'll be a little bit of overlap to begin with, but we discovered that we had a likely source of these substances that discharges to our wastewater treatment plant. That's Tribar Manufacturing. There's been some coverage in the media. They got a little bit confused about things here and there. Tribar is the new name of the company. It had purchased a company prior known as Adept Plastics. So you hear Adept, you hear Tribar, it's the same company essentially. It's just a matter of a name change. They're changing names on their operations as they go, but basically Adept or Tribar basically are the same entity. So we discovered that they had this elevated tested discharge sample at 28,000 parts per trillion for this PFOS substance. We then did our own sampling at our wastewater treatment plant for that presence of that PFOS substance as well. We took a sample in June, it tested in at 290, which was concerning enough. We got another sample from August 2018 that rose to 4,800 parts per trillion. The Michigan Department of Environmental Quality Water Quality Standard is that 12 parts per trillion that we've talked about before. And we don't have any good information as to why the change from June to August, because again, as was just mentioned, Tribar/Adept had stopped using the PFOS containing chemicals in 2015. So we're not sure exactly why we would see an elevated result of that nature. We can't identify the reason for that up until this point in time. So we continue to work with MDEQ and with Tribar from there to develop a plan to identify the source, because there's no other sources of PFAS in city operations. We mentioned firefighting foam at one point. Happily, the city of Wixom's fire department does not use a foam that contains PFAS substances, and that's documentable for the last 10 years and verifiable by personal experience from employees going back 25 years. So we didn't have that source. So apparently we had Tribar Adept as the source of the increased elevated levels that we have from our wastewater effluent or discharge from our wastewater treatment plant. In response to that, and again, working with the MDEQ, we put out an administrative compliance order to Tribar that was sent or issued on September 19th, which required a basic set of actions from Tribar by October 19th. The continuation of monthly sampling is something that just continues, right? That wasn't anything that was new, but we're requiring them to continue to sample monthly. And then from there, we want them to look at their processes, evaluate what's going on, and try to determine what the cause of these elevated levels are. Or is, depending what the situation turns out to be. Then we also required them to come up with some strategies and plans and implement those strategies and plans to reduce and eliminate PFAS substances from their wastewater discharge. Because essentially, that company has it in their discharge that comes to our wastewater treatment plant. There's no treatment in place at our wastewater treatment plant. We just become a pass-through. Whatever's in the discharge that comes to our facility exits our facility, and that's what's causing the issue. So we can go to the next slide. Since that time, I've got an update on what's happened since we've issued that ACO, the Administrative Compliance Order. Tribar initially had indicated that they were going to have a permanent solution, a permanent filtration system that they were going to put in place. That's something that's expensive and also requires work and engineering and installation to come into being. That's basically the second point there. That was going to come into play in December of 2018. Happily, just a couple of days ago, the company has informed us that they've worked with their consultants, Clean Harbors, to come up with a mobile or temporary filtration system that they are going to put in play. It basically involves bringing tanks on site, connecting it up to their discharges, filtering it through that granular activated carbon system like they're going to do in the long run with a permanent system, but doing it basically immediately. It's supposed to be coming online as early as tomorrow. So that's good news for the watershed. It's good news for us. We're very pleased to hear that from them, and that's something that they did on their own with their consultant company and informed us about. So that's coming into play. That should be coming online as early as tomorrow. The long-run plan is going to be also a granular activated carbon system that's going to come online in 2018. They intend to have redundancy into that system so that as the media is used up, this filtration media, this carbon gets used up as it filters out the substances, and once it's used up, it can't be effective any longer. So they're going to have two separate systems in play. Once the first set of carbon is exhausted, if you will, they're going to turn a switch and switch the discharge to the second system. They're going to then remove the spent carbon media. The plan is to incinerate it at this point. There might be a different alternative in the future, but right now I think the plan is to incinerate it. And then replace that media with a new set of carbon. And then once the second system is exhausted, they're going to switch over to that first. So they'll be able to maintain 24/7 operations, and that's good news as well. They do anticipate for sure that permanent system is going to bring them down to less than 12 parts per trillion, which will be in compliance with the guidelines. That's what they expect. Don't have information on exactly what this mobile temporary system is, but they did indicate they expect it to dramatically reduce the levels of PFAS in their discharge. So from there, as I mentioned, we basically suffer from it being a pass-through, right? The company passes it to us. We don't have a filtration system in place, and it goes out into our effluent. We expect that once they take care of it at the front end and screen it from their discharge to us, we'll have a corresponding improvement in our effluent sampling at our wastewater treatment plant. So that's what we're expecting. The last point that I have on the slide is we're planning additional sampling in case there are other sources in our user base that could be sourcing these kind of substances in their discharge and in our wastewater treatment plant as well. So our water consultant and the city are plotting out how to do these samplings at different locations in the city and isolate different areas of the city. If we come up with an elevated finding again, then we would go to the individual companies that might be involved and work with them to sample their discharges as well. But up until this point, the only source that's been identified in Wixom is this Tribar/Adept company. So that pretty much brings us up to date from Wixom's standpoint.
Okay, next, this is back to me. So if that was the Wixom update. So with them, for our follow-up, we're going to continue to work with the city and the facility. And so our goal is to have the effluent from the wastewater treatment plant to be meeting water quality standards at its discharge to 12. I think we're going to see once the treatment plant, the temporary treatment goes in, we're going to see a pretty dramatic decrease in what's coming from Tribar. We saw that in Lapeer. They had a temporary system, and even though it wasn't perfect, as they get the full plant in, it still had a big impact. And so I think that's really positive news that that's happening so quickly. As far as the Coes Cleaners ground up, that's our already managed site. The process water coming out, them pumping that contaminated groundwater and treating it, that's really necessary for it to continue. It's there to protect the Milford wells, which are located very close to that cleanup site. The Milford wells were sampled as part of the statewide community program, or the community sampling, and they were non-detect. So this is good news, right? We found PFAS in the groundwater that's discharging, but in the wells that are very close by, they're non-detect. And we want to keep it that way. So the DEQ is looking at trying to do some additional sampling. We have some expedited sampling that's going to be happening hopefully in the next week to try to pinpoint, which well.
It was scheduled for this morning.
That's so to try to pinpoint where is the PFAS at, and to make sure that they have a system that's, when they put the treatment in, they're scoping out treatment and that they can design it properly. For Tribar manufacturing plant 4, something I didn't cover on the previous map, when we did our sampling, we also went back to the plant at Tribar, and we actually pulled a sample of stormwater from that facility, and we sampled their source water. They have their own well, so we sampled that. the stormwater results came back elevated. They came back at 8,000 parts per trillion. And so there isn't a lot of information at where that's coming from. My understanding from the Southeast District staff that did an inspection there, that it's a clean plant on the outside. You know, they have an industrial stormwater permit, and they seem to be in compliance with it. So it's not a matter of they have messy housekeeping and they're dumping, you know, PFAS contaminated stuff outside. It's probably a lot more complicated than that. So as part of our response, we issued them a letter, today, and we're requiring them to implement controls for stormwater, do a study to make sure they understand where is that PFAS coming from. Okay, so then this is just a kind of a broad view of the watershed. So we can focus on Norton Creek, but then you've got 900 miles of the Huron River. And we want to make sure that we are able to look at any potential significant sources throughout the watershed. We don't want to fix it in one area and then still have other sources contributing. So there are other efforts going on statewide. There's a closed landfill in Lyon Township that we're working with the responsible party to do some monitoring of their groundwater. There's an automotive facility that's upstream of Ann Arbor. It's the former Sweepster plant. We've actually, the DEQ has sampled groundwater from that facility. They did detect some PFAS in the groundwater at low levels. They went back. There could be some GSI, which is our groundwater surface water interface, but it's pretty low. But they're going to come back and look at that a little bit closer. There's an analysis of our permitted discharges. I went into that a little bit in the Norton Creek area. We looked at Milford's plant, which we already talked about, the South Lyon treatment plant, seamless tube, and the GM proving grounds. Those all came back low, and either non-detect or very low. So that's all good news. We have like 7 wastewater treatment plants that discharge to the Huron River that are participating in our IPP initiative, similar to Wixom. The only one that's above water quality standards is Wixom. There's 3 that have no sources at all, or that they identified to their system, or when they sampled their effluent, they're below water quality standards. There's one, the South Huron Valley Utility Authority, that's still in the process. They've submitted a report, but I think they have some more work to do. Yeah. And then Willow Run Creek, we've already talked about. We're going to evaluate potential sources down there. Again, it's elevated in the creek, but it's not, 12 is our criteria and it's at 26. So it's something that we're going to definitely follow up on. But it's a little bit lower numbers. And the Norton Creek itself, we're going to be looking at Man Creek, which we ought to talk about, and GM to see if we can characterize that a little bit more. And then that west branch where we had that 80, because that's something that's standing out. When we look at potential sources, nothing in that area pops out as a potential source, so it's just going to take a little bit more work to go back to that west branch and see if there's something there that we're missing. Is this me or is this, okay. Okay, so what's next? We can coordinate activities with MPART agencies. We're going to keep doing that. I think this has been really successful so far. We work really closely with DHHS to protect public health and restore designated uses to Huron River. I mean, this is a main goal for us. We want to get the fishery back so that you can not just fish and have to release them, but that you can actually consume them. So this is a priority for MPART. It's a priority for my agency, the DEQ. Steve already talked about Wixom's going to do monthly wastewater treatment effluent monitoring. And like I said, we really do expect to see significant reductions once that treatment goes in tomorrow and gets online. Surface water, we're going to continue our programs, not just in the Huron, but statewide, to examine surface water. I think Joe kind of mentioned in the Huron River, we have one area that we're probably going to go back to soon to look at collecting additional surface water in Portage Lake. There's a lot of fish tissue samples that have been collected but haven't been analyzed yet, so as we get results in, that should inform DEQ DHHS more. We'll continue to review the incoming data for DHHS for that Do Not Eat Fish advisory. Continued public engagement on issues surrounding PFAS, so we're going to keep being out there and talking about this and trying to educate and inform. And, we're learning stuff. We've grown in our knowledge in the last year. It's kind of amazing how quickly we're coming. And as we go out and keep looking, we're kind of leading the nation, I think, in a lot of this effort. You have a lot of states that aren't looking, and so it seems scary right now here in Michigan because we just keep hearing about it every day, but that's because we're getting out there and getting the data and finding those sources. So, and then finally, DEQ and DHHS, we're always available to discuss any issues if you would like to.
Thank you. So we're transitioning over to the public health role. At DHHS, we really do look at people's exposure to potential chemicals, whether it's in drinking water, fish that you eat, soil that's in your yards. We do look at those chemical levels and determine potential harm. So look at the levels and say they're below something we're concerned about, they're above something we're concerned about, and then provide recommendations to people. Things like our Eat Safe Fish guidelines, so to provide different servings for fish out of different water bodies around the state based on the chemical levels. We do also work closely with our local health departments around the state and provide assistance as needed as they go about the public health role for their work, and also do different outreach and communication to the public, healthcare industries, and others that ask technical support to different state agencies as well. Next slide. Thank you. The EPA's health advisory levels, they are based on reference doses. So basically what you're talking about there is an amount of chemical that a person can swallow in some fashion every day throughout their lifetime that is not anticipated to lead to any increased risk of health effects. The particular PFOA and PFAS levels included in the EPA Lifetime Health Advisory are based on the most sensitive developmental effects found in rodents. Often we use animal studies. It's a controlled dose. We add in different safety factors. So basically, we account for how an animal processes it versus a human in this case, and so lower the number appropriately because of the uncertainty with that. A lot of times there's no clear exposure to people from a certain amount leading to a certain effect. We're free-living people. It's not as controlled as the animal studies. The Lifetime Health Advisory is for PFOA plus PFAS, so that would be one or both in any combination of 70 parts per trillion, and that's nanograms per liter. And it's in the metric system, but the value that's used in the calculation of the Lifetime Health Advisory is basically somebody drinking about a gallon of water per day for their lifetime. It covers both short and long-term exposure. Because it is based on developmental effects, it would protect the developing fetus in a pregnant woman. And in the case of PFAS and PFOA, the number that actually protects against these non-cancer health effects is lower than what we know could potentially lead to the development of cancer. And so we do also take that into consideration, and the number is the lowest. For most people, as Tracy mentioned, there's a variety of ways that most people around the country and the world are exposed to various PFAS, that's PFAS. So here is data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. There is a nationwide study done that look at a variety of chemical levels in people's blood. This shows that average levels of PFAS, PFOA, PFHXS, and PFNA in, again, a general population. So not an exposed worker population. It's people that aren't thought to be exposed to a higher level. There is detectable levels in most people's blood. It is a chemical these chemicals are used in a variety of applications, and we are exposed to a variety of chemicals. The health outcomes that have learned about so far for PFAS and PFOA, in people we know that it can alter cholesterol levels. It can be linked to alteration of thyroid hormones and thyroid disease, ulcerative colitis, which is kind of an immune-related gastrointestinal condition, and for PFOA, testicular and kidney cancer. There have also been studies that shown it's altered immune system function. And in the people side, this is what we know from human epidemiology studies. Unfortunately, there were several communities in the Ohio River Valley area, so Ohio and West Virginia, that were drinking highly contaminated water with PFOA. They had a very large follow-up looking for associations. There was about 60,000 people included in that study. And so they were able to look for different health outcomes. And a lot of times when it's not very, very obvious, like a horrible tragedy, you need that large number of people to look for any type of health effects linked to exposure. In laboratory animals, they found developmental effects. So reduced structure of the bones in the fingers of rats, decreased pup birth weight, accelerated puberty in male pups, immune system dysfunction, and altered liver and kidney weight in the animals. And again, when we're talking laboratory animals, they do get a lot higher doses. The authors and the researchers are really trying to look for the most sensitive health endpoint, and they do get a lot higher levels than certainly the general population that I was talking about, but many other communities as well. Switching gears a little bit, so one thing that we do to protect against people exposure to chemicals, as mentioned previously, is our Michigan Fish Consumption Advisory Program. We put out Eat Safe Fish guidelines and have since 1970. Our first one was for mercury. About that time, we basically, the public health community knew of a exposure in Japan to a community. Methylmercury was dumped directly into the bay. People were eating the fish. Through the horrible health effects that were seen there, it was known that people could eat fish and it may be concerning for certain chemical exposures. Please know there are no levels like that in our fish in Michigan, but it certainly identified the fact that fish consumption was a route of exposure and a preventable exposure, as we tell people the serving recommendations and what people can eat. We've added additional chemicals to the program and carried out major changes and updates as science has moved along and as we found additional chemicals. That last PFAS, 2012, that was when we first tested fish in Michigan for PFAS. We do test for more than just PFAS. So when we say that PFAS is a concern for accumulating in fish, that's because we have looked, other states have looked. PFAS is the one that primarily accumulates in fish. You can see low levels in some other fish, but PFAS is the specific one of concern. Next slide, please. The Huron River Do Not Eat Fish Advisory, the data was up on a map earlier. This is basically the entire stretch of the river that's included. The Huron River at North Wixom Road, including Norton Creek in Oakland County, downstream to the Huron River at Lake Erie and Wayne and Monroe counties. It includes Norton Creek, Hubble Pond, and Kent Lake, or Strawberry and Zuki Lakes, Gallagher, Loon, and Whitewood Lakes, Baseline and Portage Lakes, Barton Pond, Argo Pond, Getty's Pond, and Ford Lake and Belleville Lake. We do post various PFAS-related fish consumption guidelines as soon as we get data at the michigan.gov/PFAS response under Fish and Wildlife. So that is where the most current information is posted as we work to update our other materials. Why is there a do not eat advisory? So we saw the data a little bit earlier, but the Kent Lake fish fillet PFAS levels, we did issue a press release early in August. All 20 fish that were collected did have elevated PFAS levels, well above our do not eat. We did expand the do not eat advisory based on the surface water data in the Norton Creek area and the Huron River upstream of Milford. And we're concerned about what could be in the fish because we knew the surface water was elevated. One thing to note, when we do issue fish consumption guidelines, we look at the entire body of data. We would rather be conservative and provide people the option that we're not sure about this. We couldn't recommend that you would eat these fish now, even though we don't have fish data from that area yet. Baseline Lake and Argo Pond fish fillet data was received at the end of August. Again, the PFAS fish fillet levels were elevated. And so we expanded down to Lake Erie given the uncertainty. As Joe mentioned earlier, the channel catfish and flat rock were lower. We've seen catfish having lower PFAS levels when we've checked in multiple species in water bodies. So catfish aren't necessarily like largemouth bass or rock bass. And again, due to the uncertainty, wanted to cover that area until we could get additional fish from that area. Thank you. And one moment about the Portage Lake fish as well. Again, we are being cautious about that. There was a fairly large variability in the range of PFAS in the 10 fish that we have so far. And so would like additional sampling and to get the entire data set for the river before we make adjustments on that. We have worked with a variety of county health departments, local municipalities, and the Huron-Clinton Metro Parks on temporary and more durable signs. You may have seen the temporary signs in English around at different access points and locations. They were placed, I'm sorry, that's a typo, I think approximately 4 weeks ago. Now, just to update that slide, and so you may have seen them around. The more durable, so the more weather-resistant signs are under development, and so basically it's just the ordering and placing process that's going on now in Arabic, English, and Spanish. You may have also heard PFAS-containing foam was found in the Ann Arbor area of the Huron River. The important information in that press release was that PFAS don't go through the skin readily. So the PFAS levels in the surface water, if you're swimming or having recreational contact, you won't necessarily have much, if any, PFAS on your skin or in your skin to go into your body. Adults and children should avoid swallowing the foam, though. That's where the elevated levels are. And an accidental swallow of a small amount of water during recreational activities wouldn't necessarily be a health concern. People swallow very small amounts of water on accident usually, or just while they're swimming. Of course, a general public health message is untreated surface water isn't good drinking water. So we do look at small amounts of water for that. And then try to keep pets out of the foam, and that was the MDARD statement included in our press release, and rinse them off to prevent them from swallowing the foam. Thank you. For more information, there is a fairly large website, michigan.gov/PFAS response, the community water supply testing, and the school sampling. If you're interested, you can find that on the website under Testing and Treatment and Statewide Sampling Initiative. If you're interested in that data, you can go through it and look at the data yourself. There are a variety of FAQs there as well under health, and some additional information. The Fish and Wildlife tab is where we have our information. Here's our, slid back a little bit. Here's our contact information if you have additional questions. The DEQ Environmental Assistance Center can be reached at 800-662-9278. Our DHHS health hotline is 1-800-MI-TOXICS. That's 1-800-648-6942. Here's the contact information for Stephanie Kammer, Tracy Cascametti, Gerald Tiernan, Joe Bohr, myself, Jennifer Gray, Lisa Fisher, Gary Clace, 2 other toxicologists at the health department, and Steve Brown.
So that concludes that portion of this. I'm going to turn it over to Laura so she can talk about the Watershed Council and some of the stuff that they've got going on.
Christian, I'm just going to interject. Thank you for hanging with us on that. I know that was a journey, and and as always, it takes longer than we thought that it would. So we really do appreciate your attention. And a lot of that's really technical, a lot of that's new information, and it was by no means intended to keep you from asking your questions later. So we will stay here and we will answer your questions, I promise.
Thank you. I want to thank all the presenters for the information tonight. And I really hope that a lot of the information has given you a better sense of the extent of the problem and what is happening on the issues. I would say that we are really in an informational gathering period. We're trying to figure out how pervasive this chemical is. Where is it coming from? What are the appropriate thresholds that should be set? What are the appropriate measurements to protect the public health and environmental health? And so the Huron River Watershed Council is hoping to sort of put that into some kind of framework for you tonight. I know that we, and Christian has passed along, we get also a lot of questions where people are confusing the PFAS issue with other issues, particularly around algae. But also, so I wanted to point you just to a resource that's available on our website under our maps. This is called our info stream. And this has a lot of information about nutrients in our watershed. It has a lot of information about the river flow. It has information about changing weather patterns. It even has information about where your drinking water comes from. We have all the drinking water sources for all of the communities throughout the watershed on here. So it can be a go-to resource when you are wondering about what am I seeing in the river? What do I want to know about the quality here? We even have things about should I swim, etc. But I just wanted to let you know that this is here as an additional resource to complement some of the resources that you've heard about PFAS. I guess then in wrapping it up, but before we move on here, the Huron River Watershed Council is really trying to understand the gravity and the extent of this threat. And I think what we're trying to do tonight, and we will be holding another public meeting down in Washtenaw County in the next couple weeks. This is also taped, and we will be posting it on our website for you to share or for you to review. But we're really trying to work together to stop this pollution. We're really trying to work together to secure funds that allow us to continue this kind of monitoring, to have funds to clean this kind of contamination up. We're trying to protect public health. One of the things that we don't have that was presented here tonight is we don't have an established drinking water standard under the Safe Water Drinking Act. And it's one of the things that the Watershed Council would really like to see in working with our other partners. And then one of the other things that we're hoping these kinds of processes do is increase transparency. One of the things that's great is to have this kind of information shared with the public. But there's a lot of information that's being collected. The DEQ and MDHHS is doing more data collection than I've ever seen in my generations of working with the state. But we want to make sure that that information is getting out to the public, for the public to react, to engage our legislators, et cetera. So with that, I'd like to open it up to some question and answers. Again, if you can write them down on your cards and pass them to the aisle, we'll be collecting them and we can address them to the appropriate staff up behind us.
So we're going to go ahead and get started with some of the questions here. They're still collecting. If you need a card, there are cards out in the hallway, and some folks are bringing those in as well. So first question that we've got here is how long for the water to turn over in the river once the contamination has been lowered?
Joe, do you want to take that?
The question was how long for the water to turn over in the river once the contamination has decreased?
I'll try my hand at that. That's a good question, and we don't really know the answer to it, but there is some reason to hope that it moves through fairly quickly. This is weird stuff. It doesn't really bind tightly to sediments like some of the other contaminants that we work with does. It's partly a matter of how much actual contamination there is in the system at this moment. It appears like there is a lot based on what we see in the fish. The other good news is that fish tend to get rid of the PFAS, at least, the PFOS, relatively quickly. I mean, we're talking matters of months rather than years like we see in some of the other contaminants. So really, I basically can't answer the question as how long it's going to take for the Huron River. It's such a big system, and it's probably been exposed to a lot of this for a while. But if we could just turn off the spigot right now, it might. I'd only be guessing. You know, could be a generation. It could be 10 years, but I don't have any idea myself.
And Joe, can you just talk a little bit about our commitment to continue sampling for that and what we're looking to do in the future once the sources are eliminated? And
yeah, at the appropriate time, I'm sure we'll go back and collect more fish. Fish will tend to be the best measurement of how things are going. We'll do that periodically, at least maybe no sooner than 3 years, but once things have been settled down and we know we've found as many sources as we can and dealt with them as best we can, it'll be several years before we will go back and continue to monitor after that on a periodic basis. That help?
thanks, Joe.
The next one is, and I'll actually take this one, but it is, how is Milford drinking water? The village drinking water has been sampled and it was non-detect. We continue to sample on a quarterly basis, even though there's no requirement from the state to do so. We wanted to be proactive, but we're going to continue to collect that data. And if you go to our website, we've got that right on there. There's a PFAS information tab. You can click on that. It'll take you right to the page, and we'll be publishing those there as we come in. Kind of follow up to that was how was the well water in Milford Township? I know Don Green had his sampled, and I know there's a couple other sites in the township that have been sampled at non-detect. And then there's some questions in here about filters that can be used to remove these, specifically reverse osmosis.
Do you want to take that? Do we have information? Okay. I don't know, Christian, if you want to go to the website, if you go to testing and treatment, and I'm sorry, Jennifer, you're probably better to direct him,
no
but
worries.
we do have information on our website about filters.
So keep scrolling.
So again, this is that michigan.gov/PFAS response. Then
And if you, just for my own use, visit the site. They have a lot of information. They've been really good about adding questions. I know as we've forwarded questions onto them, I've gone back 2 or 3 days later and there's answers up there. So this is constantly updated and there's a lot of good information up here, so.
Yep. And so there is a certification for filters. It would be thank you, in that middle of the page, the P473 requirements. And so there are certified filters available that reduce PFAS and PFOA.
The next question, and I think I've passed this on previously, but we have a community garden here in Milford, and they use river water to water their vegetables and fruit throughout the growing season. And should they be worried about their health or discontinue the consumption of the produce from the gardens? And then the second question is there any assistance available to test the produce?
So hi, I'm Kevin from Department of Agriculture. See if how close I can get to this. There we go. Is that better? Okay. Food's a much tougher question. You've been hearing a lot of things about water, and there are specific standards for groundwater and drinking water. For food, and not just in Michigan, United States, but all across the world, there are no numbers about what's good or bad in any specific food. So if you even tested a food and you got a number, I have nothing to compare it against to tell you if that's good or bad for you. And I don't know if anybody on the planet does. We've looked at what every other country in the world does, and no one has food-specific standards anywhere, period. There's a lot of, there's probably 100 research papers that have been done on agriculture and dosing plants and how much plants will uptake PFAS. It's not like fish. Fish bioaccumulate it, so if you give them a little bit, then they expand it in their body, and you get higher numbers. Plants will maybe take up a portion of the PFAS. You get a lower number in the plant than you would have had in the drinking water or the soil. So, remember that one chart that was up there that showed the carbon and the fluorine and the chemistry? Well, these two chemicals that we're talking about, the PFOA and the PFAS, have like 7 or 8 carbon chains, and the considered somewhat safer PFAS have shorter numbers of carbon chains, maybe like 6 or 5 or 4 carbons. So these long carbon chains, like these 7 or 8 carbons, like in the two chemicals we're talking about, a lot of the research has shown that they don't penetrate to the above ground portion of the plant very well. So you aren't going to get as much of that in the edible portion of the plant above ground. So one of the ways you can reduce risk is to, but they will accumulate more in the root portion of the plant. So if you want to reduce exposure, if you don't plant root crops like potatoes, radishes, and carrots, you're going to get less PFAS typically in the above portion of the plant if you plant above ground, if you're worried. Because I said I don't have a number, but if you want to reduce risk, these are some thoughts about how to reduce risk. I can't tell you whether you should quit eating something out of your garden or not, but there's ways you can reduce exposure. You can make sure the water you're watering them with in the future is clean. That'll do a lot right there. If you're really concerned about the soil or something, it may be watered or contaminated water in the past, you could install raised beds with clean soil and then do clean water, and you're pretty much starting over at that point. That's probably the safest thing you can do if you're concerned. If you do grow root crops, if you peel them before you eat them, because research has shown that in a potato, there's more PFAS in the skin than there is in the potato itself. So if you peel the root crops, you're oftentimes getting rid of some of the PFAS that's more heavily concentrated in the skin a little bit. Just some minor things that you can do. But it's all a matter of your own personal risk. Generally, they've done more studies in Europe than they have here, but and they've done sort of market basket studies where, like in Europe, they'll go around and just buy everything that people normally eat and then test it all and kind of add it all up and see in general in your diet, are you getting too much? And over there they've found that the diet's pretty safe in Europe, and American food supplies are somewhat comparable. There's been less testing done in the U.S., but the stuff that's been done here hasn't shown a problem in the general food supply. So, really where we worry is if somebody's dosing pretty highly contaminated water on a garden and then they're eating it almost exclusively as like, I only eat the fruit and vegetables I grew all year round, and you had heavily contaminated water that you were using or canning with or irrigating with, and then you eat it constantly. I mean, that gives you probably your most exposure and the most worry. If it's something occasional you're eating, and like I said, you're going to get a lot less in the plant than you would in the initial water. And like what you saw with fish, I mean, you're going to get, where water may be 70, the level of concern in a fish is like 300 because you're eating a lot less fish, so it takes a bigger dose to get it. And the same thing would be with plants. You'd have a much higher number in plants if you were to test, probably that would be before you'd have concern, because you're just not eating that much. So I know that's not a direct answer, but it can give you some idea. I mean, and if it depends how risk averse you are and how concerned you are about it. Maybe you'd say, I've been eating it for 10 years, I don't care, and that's fine. Maybe you don't want to feed it to your grandkids, but you eat your fruits and vegetables yourself if you're a healthy adult. You know, things like that that you can do to adjust your exposures and risk. I'll leave blood tests to DHHS.
Well, as I showed a graph that had blood testing, there are ways to measure PFAS levels in people's blood. Unfortunately, there is no context for your blood test, so it could be compared to the U.S. general population, and you would know where you fell in a population in the U.S. It's not like looking at drinking water levels and saying, well, we'd like to keep you below this number for your entire life. There's no blood level of concern, so no blood level where we would say you were more at risk than anybody else with a lower blood level of PFAS. We just don't have that knowledge on these chemicals and many others for the actual blood level of concern.
We had a bunch of questions that deal more with wildlife. The impacts on wildlife along the Huron River are in, so either from impacts on amphibians, macroinvertebrates, up to birds and waterfowl. So I don't know.
We are collecting these questions for the DNR to address, and so if they've left their contact information on the cards, we can pass those along and individuals will be contacted. If not, those of you with those questions, please find me after the meeting and we'll write down your contact information, and there will be follow-up from the DNR on wildlife health.
Yeah,
Well,
we've
the
had
only
those
thing I could-
questions.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
The only thing I could add to that is we do have the surface water values that are extremely high that were designed to protect wildlife, including aquatic life and wildlife that would be drinking the water. So that there is some protection there, at least based on those numbers. The numbers are extremely high compared to the 11 and 12 that we're dealing with for human consumption or human health.
Okay. There were a bunch of questions also about drinking water wells. In particular, a lot about should individuals get their personal or their home wells tested? Should they be concerned? What kinds of precautions? Where they can get it tested? I don't know if that's more MDHHS.
Do you want to? Sure. So, like Jennifer mentioned, we have the information on our website about filters. And so if you're just generally concerned and you would like to have a filter on your home drinking water, that information is on our website. The other thing is if people are interested in doing this testing themselves, right? So if any of you are on a private well, I always tell people you're the only one testing that water, right? So, before it was PFAS, we wanted to make sure you were testing your well for nitrates and coliform, right? Or maybe arsenic, right? But you were the only one doing that, right? And your health department would help you with that. And so if this is a concern for you and you'd like to sample it, we have found some labs that are willing to work with homeowners on that. And we do have some information on our website about how you would collect that sample. before you go and find that on our website, I do want to caution you that the procedure and the guidance that we've put out there is actually really lengthy, because this is a very delicate thing to sample for. Because remember how we talked about there's so many products in your home, lotions and your pizza box on your kitchen counter, and so many things that could influence the result of that sample. I don't want you to be scared off, but there is a pretty lengthy procedure to read through if you were thinking about doing that sampling yourself. The departments certainly don't endorse any particular lab, but we did have a staff person call some labs today to see if they do work with residents, and we did find some that will analyze the sample and or would, for an additional fee, of course, come out and collect the sample for you. So we do have some information on who those labs are. So if any of you are particularly interested in that, come and find us afterward. But I would, I don't think we have the slides up anymore, but I would remind you back, I mean, I know it was 4 hours ago we put up the slide that showed all of the public water supplies, but we have sampled a number of public water supplies across Oakland County and in your area that are groundwater supplies, and they were all non-detect for PFAS. And so I think that does tell us something. I mean, certainly it's not a comprehensive groundwater investigation across the area, but it does tell us something. And the sources that we're dealing with, we know are sources that are discharging directly into the creek. So you might hear, like in Parchment or up near Wordsmith, you have these groundwater plumes that are venting into lakes, right, or intersecting people's homes. We're not dealing with an area that we know where the groundwater has been contaminated and that's what's moving. We're talking about water that's moving through a pipe into a creek. And so those two things together do give me some comfort on the groundwater front. But certainly if you are concerned, we can help connect you with those sort of resources.
I just pulled up the.
Thank you, Christian.
You can actually search on the website for a system.
Yeah.
So I searched for the village system, so you can see it there, and it's got the date.
A couple of shorter answered, I think. When will the PFAS data for the Kelsey Hayes groundwater cleanup be available?
Sure, we're expecting results from Kelsey Hayes within the next 2 weeks. We should have those results back.
Okay. Could we have a link to the slide presentation for reference and review? Is this something, Sharon?
I think so.
Yeah, I think we'd be able to post that.
Okay,
and
so we
provide a
can
link.
post that on our website
On the
and
village,
on
yeah.
the Village of Milford, and we can share that with audience members. What actions are being taken to replace PFAS in firefighting foam so new sites are not created?
It's a good one.
I know many communities have phased it out. I know that there's actually legislation right now in front of the president to sign this. This came out of the hearing that Senator Gary Peters had last week in front of the EPA. There is a bill to phase out PFAS in firefighting foams. I don't know of any state legislation, but I do know the state was doing an inventory of all of the.
Yeah. So we did work with the
facilities.
state fire marshal on that, and I don't know if there's someone at the table better versed in this, but the one thing to remember is that PFOS and PFOA are no longer manufactured in the United States. But like we said, this is a whole family, big, extended family of chemicals. And so I think what's in firefighting foam now is next gen or next generation, right? And so what we don't have a lot of information is on the toxicological properties of the chemicals that we're replacing it with. So I don't know if you want to.
As you mentioned, there was a survey that the fire marshal sent around to all the fire departments to look at what they had, how much they had, and they are working to provide guidance on what to do about the situation. The firefighting foam does save lives, and so there's active investigation into what to recommend and next steps.
So the one thing I would add to that is, you had some fire agencies previously training with those materials, and I think there's more of an awareness now that you don't train with that stuff, you save that for the life-saving necessity, and that now we may have to go back after a fire and address the things that we put on the ground, right? So, if you think about, a tanker fire, if you remember a tanker hitting the freeway a number of years ago and all the fuel catching fire, we put that fire out. We worry about that fuel moving into our sewer systems or into the ground on the side of the road. Now we're going to be addressing also the PFAS.
couple kind of here. Some of the data that was shown was in parts per trillion. There was a couple of slides, I think, that were parts per billion. What is the difference for those, and when is it used?
Yep. So I think that's the fish versus the water data. So the water data is in parts per trillion. As mentioned before, it's parts of chemical in a trillion parts of water. The fish data is parts per chemical in a billion parts of fish. So basically what we're looking at is the difference between people drinking a gallon of water per day versus eating an 8-ounce portion size of fish per serving. So when we look at the numbers, it's basically the difference between the amount of water and the amount of fish that we do typically eat.
What type of state funding is available for the work that is going on? And a loaded question, is there enough?
Steph, do you want to, are you familiar with the funding part?
So I am vaguely familiar with the funding. So MPART, I think the legislator did provide, was it $23 million?
$23 million.
I'm looking in the back and she's nodding her head. So $23 million for us to do some PFAS efforts. We have been plowing through that and doing a lot statewide. Is it enough? I think there's, we have a lot of work to do. We are scrambling to try to keep up. We have a lot of funds, but no staff to do it. So we are, within my agency, we're working really hard. I think as the situation grows, I think we're going to need additional funding, I guess. If anybody wants to add to that.
I will add to that from a Watershed Council point of view. As many people know, we passed the Clean Michigan Initiative bond, about 10, 15 years ago, and those funds really facilitated a lot of cleanups throughout the state, additional monitoring, especially around algae blooms, a lot of infrastructure work to bring our drinking water and wastewater treatment plants up to snuff. That money is all gone, and there's been a lot of talk about how to replace that. It's something that the Watershed Council has teamed up with a lot of our infrastructure and water advocates. They haven't suggested replacing the bond initiative, but the governor has put forth ideas about a tipping fee on landfills that would go to replace some of the Clean Michigan Initiative funds. And so that is a big source of funding that the DEQ has relied on, and I know many of our municipalities in our watershed have benefited from.
Thank you, Laura. You took the words out of my mouth. So keep your eyes on the media for that discussion about increasing our tipping fee on our solid waste landfills, because that really is intended to provide a sustainable funding source for all of our environmental protection programs.
So there's a series of questions that deal with, there are a number of lakes and streams that are not within the fish advisory but connect to that in some fashion. Is the water a concern in those tributaries and then those lakes, and is there any advisories for those fish out of those lakes or tributaries?
It's a tag team. So I'll start. So we have Eat Safe fish guides of chemicals that we've tested certain fish species out of certain water bodies. For ones that we haven't tested, we actually have statewide safe fish guidelines. We know based on statewide data sets that there is mercury of some amount in the fillets of fish, and so every inland water body is covered by an Eat Safe fish guideline, either by direct testing or knowledge of statewide levels. In terms of water flow in the system and other.
And I know one of the questions I got before, and I didn't see it in the pile yet, but Proud Lake itself is just outside of the advisory area on the Huron. Are the fish safe to eat out of Proud Lake?
So, unless you want? No?
Go ahead.
Okay, so Proud Lake, we did stop the advisory area at North Wixom Road. We knew from the surface water data that the PFAS levels were low. That is on the list of locations for testing to confirm that, but we do not have indication at this time that surface water coming from the Proud Lake area would be elevated until the fish would have elevated levels of PFAS. So we have no data showing that.
And is there kind of a similar question, where can we find specific data on the fish tested, what type of fish, the location, and the results?
Absolutely. So for our data sets, everything currently in our guide is posted on our website at www.michigan.gov/eatsafefish. We have a 9-button format. There is a reports and science link, and we do post data summaries for every data set. We are actively working on keeping that data set updated to make sure that you have the latest data and the most current data sets for the guidelines. We will post them as soon as they're available for all of it. You are welcome to email me if you're not finding on the website the location and the fish of interest. My apologies, we are behind in getting those data sets up. Please contact me.
Or you can contact me if you want the actual raw data.
We
Play with that.
do package it.
For any fish biologists in the audience.
These are some questions about Tribar and Wixom in general. To the DEQ, are you relying on Tribar's assurances that they're no longer using PFAS? Do you have any way to investigate?
Do you want me to take that, or do you? You can go for it, Anna.
Sure, I can answer that. So I work in Southeast Michigan in the industrial pretreatment program. So Wixom is one of my facilities that I have compliance for. And I am one of 3 people in the state of Michigan that is doing the overview of the PFAS IPP initiative. I just happen to be in the Southeast Michigan office. So we are assured that Tribar is not using PFOS chemicals due to the ban that was in place in 2015. We are partnering with the EPA, Office of Research and Development, to do testing on the new chemical that they're using. Because we know there are PFAS chemicals in it, but we know there's not PFOS. So we're working with the EPA to try to figure out what is happening in these platers, in their tanks, that's causing them to still discharge PFOS, because we know they're not using that. And so we'll be doing additional sampling at Tribar. We'll be taking samples from their actual etch tanks, taking samples of their actual, product that they're using, that they use to protect worker health and safety from the hexavalent chrome that they're using, to figure out what's happening. And we do know, like we've said before, these chemicals are very persistent. They're sticky. And so we're trying to figure out, is this at Plant 4, is this a historical issue where that, even though after they switched, is that PFOS chemical still somewhere in the plant? And so we're working with the city and Tribar to figure that out. Was there more questions?
Yep, more questions on Tribar. So there was a question about you testing the effluent coming out of Tribar's plant. Have you tested the influent? So I guess that would mean their drinking water or their well?
Right, we did do a sample they have a private well, so we did pull a sample from their influent, and that did come back at 6. So not non-detect, but it's at 6 parts per trillion.
There's another question, or a few of them, about the granular activated carbon. What happens to that as it collects the PFAS? How is that disposed of? There's a question about incineration. What are the options for disposal of spent carbon, et cetera?
Those are all good questions, and we as a state agency are still learning the answer to a lot of those questions. Most often that the spent carbon, it can be regenerated to some point, but after it gets done and it can no longer take those PFAS chemicals, it will most likely be landfilled. And so again, we're trying to figure out, when you landfill it, when it eventually ends up in leachate and goes to a treatment plant, we're trying to figure out how to work with that. And there's also a way to incinerate the carbon. So I can't remember the exact temperature Fahrenheit where you can incinerate the carbon and it basically destroys those carbon fluorine bonds. So it removes all the PFAS.
So I would just add one thing to that, and when we talk about incineration for chemical destruction, it's not the kind of incineration like you would get at the incinerator down in Detroit. Like a municipal solid waste incinerator does not burn hot enough to destroy that, so it would be at like a hazardous waste incinerator.
A couple questions now for Wixom Wastewater Treatment Plant. Are you planning to treat your effluent for PFAS?
No, there's no current plans to do that at the city level. The efforts that have been undertaken in other parts of the state and other areas have all focused on eliminating the source of the PFAS, PFOA substances. So no, there's no current plans to do anything at the city of Wixom on that front. It's to eliminate it at the source at this company or other sources as are identified, to require them to eliminate it from their wastewater first, as opposed to at the plant level.
And then a couple questions on the sludge or biosolids coming out of the Wixom Wastewater Treatment Plant. Are those land applied? Who regulates those? Are they used as fertilizer?
The city of Wixom has land applied in the past. Unrelated to this situation, we had switched to a different methodology of handling that, and we had been taking it to landfill. So currently, in the recent history, it's been taken to landfill. In the past, there was land application that was done with biosolids. But that was for a different reason. It was discontinued.
And then there's a general question, why these discharges from both Tri-Bar or the city of Wixom should not be stopped immediately.
So I guess I'll take that one. So I went through this a little bit earlier, but this is an emerging issue. The fact that we're finding this is a good thing, that we've identified them. The city of Wixom has been very cooperative and working with us in our IPP initiative. We just rolled it out in March. They went through it. They identified Tri-Bar. They immediately started working with Tri-Bar. Like Ann explained and I explained earlier, this is not a case of like the facility dumping and on purpose. And it's not something that you can just flip a switch. They can shut down, empty out some tanks, clean them out, start back up the next day, and your discharge is gone. It's something that they're going to need to install treatment on, and it's going to take a process. They had to go through a study and figure out what treatment they needed. And so, why we'd like it, I think intuitively you just want to shut it down and then move on. In reality, we need to be working with our partners, with the city and the company, so that they can address the situation appropriately. And in this case, tomorrow they're going to put their treatment in place. So hopefully we're going to see those reductions really quickly here. And the scope of things, how quickly this has moved, we identified the issue, Wixom did, in the end of June, basically. So within just a few months, we're right at treatment, and we're going to have a major source reduction there. So I think that's positive.
I think the second part of that question is, why don't you shut down the Wixom wastewater treatment plant? I think that's just generally a terrible idea. I think the folks in the city of Wixom would prefer that their wastewater treatment plant continue to operate, right?
I can affirm that, yes, right.
Series of questions here just about how the sampling takes place with a water treatment plant. Are you sampling the intake as well as the discharge to the distribution system? And when you're sampling for PFOS, do you test for other water quality parameters at the same time and the same sample?
Christian, that was on drinking water sampling? Yeah. Do you want me to take that? So when the Public Water Supply Initiative is conducted, they sample both the raw water and the finished water. So if that's a groundwater source or a surface water source, they're sampling both. They sample for a whole suite of PFAS chemicals. I think it's 24 of them. That initiative is specific to PFAS. So the state going out and sampling water systems, that is a specific PFAS initiative. But every public water supply in the state is regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act and is required to sample for a range of chemicals on a given frequency. So, we're all very familiar with lead copper monitoring, right? They also sample for organisms like cryptosporidium and things that could make you sick, right? So they sample for all of those things on their own and report that back to the department, but this initiative is specific to PFAS.
Thank you. This question deals kind of with interaction with the EPA and whether or not the state is working with the EPA on lowering the standards, as well as working with federal legislators on that issue.
Yeah. Yeah, so I would offer that the EPA is in Michigan today and tomorrow, right? And our director and our executive leadership is with them right now. They did a tour of the Ann Arbor water plant this evening, and Stephanie took them around and showed them some parts of the Huron watershed, and they're meeting in Parchment tomorrow. And so we're very engaged with the EPA, and there was a national conference earlier in the summer where they laid out a number of things that they were committed to doing, and one of those was to develop a level for the Safe Drinking Water Act.
There's a couple of questions about sediment sampling around sort of tri-bar and remediation, and I think one of my understandings is that because this is a surfactant, it stays pretty much on the top of the water column and is not accumulating in the sediment. And so is not something that will be sticking around in the sediment for a long time. But because we have so many questions, I was just wondering if somebody could comment on that.
So within Norton Creek, I think that's the general understanding, is that it isn't supposed to connect with the sediment there. You know, we don't have a lot of sediment sampling out there on PFAS, so I think that understanding might be from sampling that maybe was done in other states. So that is that is what we see now, and I don't know if the organic material matters at all, or Joe, if you know that, but I think as time goes forward and the wastewater treatment plant's effluent decreases, I think we'll see those surface water numbers come down.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so at Tri-Bar itself, you know, right now we don't have any soil samples at that facility.
And then the last question, sort of similar to that, is are you aware of any surface water, groundwater interactions in Norton Creek?
Yeah, so that's an issue that we've certainly given a lot of thought to as well. So it's hard to know whether a stream is a gaining stream or a losing stream, right? Whether or not the groundwater is seeping in or the river water, and that can change during the year with different seasonal conditions. And so we have a hydrogeologist from Michigan State, who's sort of a expert in hydrogeology that we have on contract with through the MPART system, that's going to be evaluating and looking at that and advising us as to whether or not there's any areas where we should be sampling groundwater adjacent to Norton Creek. And I would expect that we would be doing some of that work very soon.
Couple questions to close it out, and then we'll wrap things up here. If your question wasn't asked, Watershed Council is compiling the other questions. There were a couple that kind of repeated or were somewhat similar, so they're going to compile those, and then we'll try to follow up as best we can on that. One of the questions I had here was just the contact info for the speakers. The presentation that was done, I know I'm going to upload it to the village website. I believe the Watershed Council is going to upload it. Wixom's going to probably upload it, and Milford Township. So you can go to any of the municipalities. The Watershed Council, I think the state's been uploading to this website. I think you can find most of the presentations they've done on this site as well. So, and then the last question that we'll close things out with here is it has to do with notification of the public and local governments. So, as these tests come back out, what is the plan to reach out to local governments so that they can help spread the word amongst the community, and then to notify the public? What is that plan?
So we have done, with the Huron, we have done 2 webinars with our local units of governments, the health departments, the Huron River Watershed Council, and the Metro Parks. And we do that as we get new data that we feel that, you know, we need to keep people informed on. So I can't say that that's going to happen, you know, monthly or quarterly, but I think as new data develops, I think we would go through that process again. I think we're available to talk to the community. Again, you know, we came here. I think if there's new information that we feel, you know, would benefit for us to be here, we'd definitely be willing to do that.
And all of that community water supply testing is posted to the website within 48 hours. And so I think all of Oakland County's data is already up there, but I think Livingston County's not quite complete yet, or if you have interest in other areas of the state, all of that information's put online.
Okay. With that, we're going to go ahead and wrap things up. I want to thank everybody from the state agencies for coming out. I want to thank Wixom, the Huron River Watershed Council, Milford Township as well. And I want to thank all of you for sticking around for the full 2 hours. So hopefully you learned something, and feel free to share this. Look for the video shortly, and please do share that information with your friends and neighbors. So thank you.
Thank you.